Hello, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to McGuireWoods' first African American Leaders in the Law webcast. I can't tell you how excited I am about this event and more so the incredible leaders we have on this panel. In February of this year, McGuireWoods partnered with Bank of America to host an event called Partnering for Progress in Diversity and Inclusion. This event was held at the African American History and Culture Museum at the Smithsonian. It was an incredible event. We had an incredible panel, and we discussed racial justice as it relates to the police, education, diversity, inclusion in the legal system, and many more topics. Little did we know at the time that within a few weeks there would be a pandemic, and that after the pandemic, there would be great social unrest following George Floyd's killing. And so it's in light of that that we thought it was very important to convene this event, because we believe that our community, our profession, our organizations, and frankly, our country need to hear from the wonderful voices we have assembled on this panel. And so I'm going to introduce the members of the panel in a moment, but it just didn't seem right to me to have an event like this and not acknowledge the incredible loss our country has faced with the death of the Honorable John Lewis. He has been fighting social and racial discrimination before most of us on this call were born. And many of us, directly or indirectly, have benefited from the great sacrifices and work that the Honorable John Lewis paid throughout the course of his life. And so I just wanted to acknowledge his passing, as I know many on this call are, and McGuireWoods is as well. So with that, I want to turn now to this event and introduce our panel. First, I'd like to introduce to you Kojo Garatego. Kojo is the Executive Vice President, Chief Legal Officer for Duke Energy. I'd also like to introduce to you Eve Runyon. Eve is the President and Chief Executive Officer for the Pro Bono Institute, PBI. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce to you Bradley Gayton, the Chief Administrative Officer and General Counsel for Ford Motor Company. I was teasing Bradley that the news broke this morning, and some of you on this call know, many of you don't, but that Bradley in about a month has been going to be the Senior Vice President and General Counsel for the Coca-Cola Company. So we have this great panel of folks, and we're going to get right into our first question here. And the first question is for you, Bradley. Since the George Floyd's killing, each of our organizations have been challenged, as has our entire society, with meaningfully advancing racial justice, particularly the role of law enforcement in meeting that challenge. Tell us about your personal experience that has shaped your perspective on racial justice.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thanks to McGuireWoods, and thanks to Bank of America for sponsoring, and my great friend and mentor, David Leach, as well, who's General Counsel at Bank of America. You know, John, this, I thought deeply about this question over the last few months, right? And as I've thought about it, you know, I do have a personal story about my own interaction with law enforcement, but as I kind of pull back the aperture on this, I really kind of think about the impact of systemic racism and the impact that has had on members of my family. And when I think about systemic racism, the framework that's most helpful for me to think about is this concept of the groundwater approach that many of you have heard about. This notion that if you see one fish belly up dead in a lake, your instinct is to examine the fish to understand what's wrong with the fish. But if the next day you turn up and half the lake's filled with dead fish, your inclination is to examine the lake to understand what's wrong with the ecosystem in the lake. But if what you find is 5, 6, 10 lakes around you all have the same condition, then you go to look at the groundwater that kind of connects these lakes and the ecosystem underneath it. And for me, what I think about when I think about this issue, it is the issue of healthcare, financials, our financial well-being, the criminal justice system, education. And to me, those are those different lakes. And to me, this issue of systemic racism means that we have to look at that entire ecosystem and how they each impact the other. How criminal justice is linked to the education system, which is linked to financial conditions in healthcare. And so when I think about your question about a personal experience, I think of my grandfather who couldn't finish high school, had to work very difficult, laborious jobs, had health conditions that were negative as a consequence of that, and died having 4 or 5 heart attacks by the age of 55. And so it's not your classic story of I've been pulled over by a police officer, but I just use that as an example to highlight that this is a systemic problem, and those lakes of healthcare, financial well-being, criminal justice, education are all connected to the problem, and they all have to be part of the solution.
Very good. Kojo, you want to weigh in on that? What personal experiences have you had that have formed you in this area of racial justice?
Thank you, John. And like Bradley, I do want to thank McGuireWoods for hosting this event. I also want to give a shout out to David Leach, who was the first general counsel to reach out to me when I got named general counsel of Duke Energy. He and I in Charlotte, and he invited me to lunch and came out and sat with me. And so I consider him a mentor as well. So thank you, David, for that. As to the question itself, it's interesting. My experience, may be different from many others. As you know, I am from Ghana, grew up in Ghana, left Ghana at 19 and went to college or university in Canada, McGill University. And my first year there, I remember I lived in a neighborhood right off campus named the McGill Ghetto, and one day, broad daylight, I'm walking home and I get stopped by the police, and they ask me what I'm doing in the neighborhood. And so for a person who comes from a culture where most of the people are of color and you are the majority, to suddenly show up in an environment where you're the distinct minority, where you're not even expected to be in a ghetto, was kind of jarring for me. And, and I was right outside my home. So I told the officer I lived right there, and he said he wanted to see me open the door and go in. And that's exactly what I did. I had to put my key in, open the door and go in before he drove away. But that was quite jarring to me because it was not an experience I'd ever had before. Fast forward several years, I finished undergraduate, I go to law school, I'm trying to get a job. And I find that about 99% of the interviews I go to, we spend 99% of our time talking about my name, a very foreign sounding name. And I remember, and this was in the 80s when we didn't have text messages and it was very expensive to call. And most of my communication with my parents was by letter. Handwritten letters. And I remember writing to my father asking for permission to change my name, because I thought the name I had was just not acceptable in the culture I had immigrated to. So these are some very jarring experiences for me that have formed my own views on, how I behave today, how I expect others to behave, how I raise my 3 daughters. And I felt so strongly eventually when I came to accept there was a way to navigate through the system and still excel. I sort of doubled down by giving each one of my daughters an African name, except for my youngest, who ended up with Grace or Gracie. But even she has an African name that we call her by at home. So these events and these experiences certainly impact how you view the world, how you behave, how you conduct business. and your views on how to make change.
Mm-hmm. Kojo, I think we can all testify that you learned to navigate it very, very, very well. So given where you are and where you've come from, so that's great. Eve, I'm going to turn to the next question that I'm going to send your way. And here's the question. Ronald Serpas, former superintendent of the New Orleans Police Department and a leading voice for criminal justice reform, as co-chair of the Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration, recently told Law 360, quote, by and large, many people literally serve a life sentence 3 days at a time. They get arrested for trespassing, public defecation, or something that disturbed the neighborhood or business. They go to jail and either sober up or get some level of mental health or medical care, get out of jail 3 days later, and within 3 days collapse into the same routine, end quote. Clearly, these bigger picture societal issues have a dramatic impact on racial justice. Can we address both immediate and long-range issues? If so, how?
Well, thank you, John, for that question, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. And I don't want to be the odd person out, so in addition to thanking McGuireWoods, I will also thank David Leach, who has been a tremendous supporter of pro bono legal services over the years. And so it's a pleasure to be able to participate in this panel that's sponsored by David and Bank of America. With regard to the question, I think this is a particularly challenging question considering the moment that we're in right now. In the wake of the murder of George Floyd, of Ahmaud Arbery, of Breonna Taylor, the protest and response and the actions taken against the protesters, as well as even what we saw happen in New York with Amy Cooper, there has been a heightened awareness of racial injustice and racial inequities. And there is an immediate groundswell. There's an immediate desire for people to get involved. But to Bradley's point at the start of this conversation, the challenges that we are facing are entrenched and they are pervasive. It's not something that we can address with immediate action and hope for immediate change. John, to your comment about the loss of John Lewis this weekend, who was a legendary civil rights leader, he was one of the original freedom riders. That was an effort to pressure government to enforce a Supreme Court decision that found that segregation in interstate busing was unconstitutional. And in addition to that, John Lewis participated in the bus boycotts in Montgomery and the sit-ins and helped organize the March on Washington. And I think his action really sort of demonstrates how we can think about approaching solutions of both immediate, short-term, as well as long-term. And so, for example, the effort with the Freedom Summer was an effort to get people to register to vote. And so that was individual action, individual engagement that was immediate and that would bring changes to people's lives and it would allow them to actively participate in our democracy. The work that he was doing with regard to the bus boycotts was looking at policies to bring about changes in segregation laws, and it was really looking for long-term solutions. And I think using that approach of thinking how we can bring assistance to individuals and how we can work to bring about immediate changes to make a difference in people's lives is extremely important. But it's also really important to think strategic and long-term and what impact can we have with regard to policies that are holding people back and are serving as oppressive actions. One of the things that we have been doing at PBI is working with law firms and with in-house legal departments and thinking through how they can get involved and what does it mean for them to focus on immediate problems in addition to longer term problems. And we advise folks at first, it's really important that we are educated, that we understand what the problems are and how they are acting to oppress communities of color. It's also important for us to be very intentional with our actions and to make sure that the services that we're providing are directly serving brown and Black communities. Also to adopt a strategic approach to think about what impact can we have, what policies can we change, but also think holistically. How are we impacting individuals as well as how are we impacting communities? And then finally, it's extremely important for us to combine resources, that we really do have the intention of not just America, but the world. And this is a time for us to think about how we can creatively combine our resources, our time and talents to make a difference.
Great. I want to ask you a brief follow-up question, Eve, because you, when I talked to you about this several weeks ago, you're just very, very passionate and I could tell had a lot of experience on maybe getting ahead of our skis, if I can use that term. I'm wondering if you might just talk just a little bit about that, why it's so important to be both intentional and strategic.
Yeah, and I think it sort of, what we're talking about are systems, and what we're talking about policies that are entrenched and that have been around for a long time. And we've been at this work for a long time. And so it's really important for us to think about new approaches to how we solve problems, and to be strategic in how we solve problems, and to be united in how we solve problems. There's an effort that the Pro Bono Institute started in Minnesota that uses collective impact, which is a theory that the philanthropic community has embraced in order to solve systemic problems. And it brings together different segments of the community to develop a plan and to focus resources in support of that plan. And it's a unique approach to how we can move things forward that have been entrenched and that have posed problems for decades. And so I think it's really important, especially now, because this is a unique moment for us to seize solutions that think about solving problems as opposed to just dedicating resources.
Very good.
John, can I add to that?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Bradley.
So I think this is a really important point. And one of the things that we're focused on is this issue that Eve is mentioning, being intentional, being strategic. And right now, what I'm seeing is this tension between speed to do something on one axis, and on the other axis, sort of the depth of thinking and strategy that's going in here. And the one thing I would say to add to this is I'm concerned that in an effort to get speed, some of the thinking for solutions is too shallow. And the risk in that is that we won't take, I hate to say it this way, advantage of this crisis to really get at trying to come up with strategies that solve this long-term systemic racism that I mentioned earlier that Eve is talking about now. And so one of the concerns I have is a potential distraction is the focus on police reform. I do think it's required, but there's just an overwhelming focus on it. And call me naive or not, but I also happen to be one of these people that think that the men and women that get up every day to keep our community safe, the overwhelming majority of them do it well. And so when we talk about the complexity of this problem, as I described with kind of the groundwater approach, I don't hear enough of discussion around this interconnected ecosystem and how we bring voices like Eve to the table that are going to think intentionally and strategic about solving a problem at that level. Yes, we probably do need police reform, but the balance of the conversation in my mind is disproportionately weighted there and not on a long-term strategy.
Kojo, well, Bradley raises a really good point about this tension between the needing something to be done immediately versus having the strategic approach that Eve has talked about. Why do you think that there is such an emphasis on the immediate, and what have what within your organization are you thinking about in terms of that balance?
Yeah, I totally agree with Bradley about the immediate response and the inordinate focus on one aspect of what we've all identified as a structural systemic issue. And I do believe that it's going to take change at one institution at a time. And that takes time. That takes courage. That takes patience. In our institution, we certainly have, for a very long time, had values that are against racism. Our particular law department, Office of General Counsel, we've been ahead of the curve, I don't mind saying this, of several other institutions in terms of what we've strived to do. We've had a diversity and inclusion council for many years. And for many years, it's advancing diversity and inclusion has been part of our short-term incentive goals. In other words, we have money tied to it, and sometimes we do well and sometimes we don't. But a lot of it is grounded in having conversation. And if I'm expecting my team to have ongoing conversation about some of these difficult issues, I've got to be willing to have them myself. I've got to be transparent. I've got to be open. And, so I try to lead by being visible on these issues. I try to make sure that everybody knows we have an open door. If I want you to hear me, I've got to be willing to hear you. And we from different backgrounds. That's the beauty of diversity, right? The differences in background, the differences in education, the differences in culture, all of it adds value. And so I certainly expect that as we have these conversations, we hear each other out. Many times we're going to learn some of the misconceptions are based on misinformation. And you're able to provide the correct information and people adjust. And working together, back to something else Eve said earlier, it's got to be a collaborative effort. And working together, we can come up with better solutions than individual institutions trying to go at this alone.
Outstanding. I'm going to pose the next question to you, Kojo. And you've touched upon this a little bit, but within your own organization, how do you lead by example during these challenging times while cultivating the next generation of leaders, especially diverse leaders? How do you make sure these young leaders are seen and heard within your organization? And how do you marry up the energy of the young leaders, which I would submit is sometimes the immediacy, right? And the experience of the older leaders to generate good solutions? We'll start with you, Kojo.
Thank you, John. I've talked a little bit about how I lead in this area, but the other thing I want to point out is that we all have biases. That's the first thing we all need to recognize. We all have implicit biases. Might not be based on race. It might be by proximity. So for a leader like me in an organization where we serve 7 states, actually more than 7 states, but we've got lawyers in several states. And, if there's an important assignment to be handed out, do I just think of the folks who are close to me in Charlotte, where I sit? Or do I think about the right person to do the job who may be in Indiana, for example? That requires intentionality. I think Eva's used that term before too. We've got to be very intentional, and I have to be very intentional. So intentional about the composition of teams, who gets to sit on what team, who gets to do what assignment, the intentionality of providing opportunities for presentations to leadership, to my own leadership team or to the senior management team, so that folks are seen and heard and their capabilities are demonstrated. Those are all things you've got to be intentional about. You can't just let things run on autopilot, right? Otherwise, things won't change. And if you want to highlight a particular talent, you've got to tap them on the shoulder. You've got to expose them. So certainly my leadership, I will say, is grounded in intentionality when it comes to these issues. I mentioned the goals we have. I've got personal goals that my CEO holds me accountable to on diversity and inclusion goals. One of my personal goals this year, on which my compensation will be based, is I've got, as you know, John, I'm big on mentoring, which is the other piece of the answer here, in terms of marrying the enthusiasm of the younger folks, the experience of the older folks. I think mentoring helps. I encourage mentoring. I advocate for mentoring, and I've committed to mentor additional people of different backgrounds this year. I've got several mentors throughout the organization and outside the organization, but I've taken on 2 more in the organization so that they can learn from my background. They can learn from my culture. They can learn from some of the things we're doing in the Office of General Counsel that can be translated or transferred to other parts of the business.
That's great. Eve, I wondered if you could take answer that question, particularly as Kojo was talking about some of the young leaders in the next generation. How are you handling that within your organization?
I think one of the things that's extremely important about this movement is that we are seeing young people passionately get involved. And so clearly this is something that they are very interested in and have their own experiences they're bringing to the table. It's important, as Kojo was saying, to make sure that people are given a voice and that leadership is listening. One of the things that, not so much within PBI, but with regard to the firms and departments that we've been working with, there has been an effort to think through what law firm legal department engagement looks like in racial justice issues, and a number of firms and departments have created funds to support racial justice issues, to support racial justice organizations, and to support community engagement. And it's extremely important that young people have a voice in how those resources are being used, that they are being directed towards organizations that speak directly to what they are passionate about. I think that's an important part of making sure that they are part of the communication and have a seat at the table.
Very good. I'm going to go to the next question, and I'm going to start with you, Bradley. In a recent report, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights looked ahead to emerging civil rights issues of the future, including criminal justice. How can law firms and corporate law departments work together with pro bono and other efforts to help address the civil rights issues of today and the civil rights issues of tomorrow?
Thank you. Thank you for that, John. I think one of the things I'll mention is that report. It was really startling in one way, and that I didn't see much difference in the civil rights issues of yesterday and those of today or tomorrow. 2/3 of the issues really are around education, criminal justice, and voting rights still. And so it is, when you think about how deeply entrenched this issue is, to think that those are still the key issues is kind of alarming. But inside criminal justice, we're talking about criminal justice reform, juvenile justice reform, things like civil asset forfeiture, and obviously police violence, which we talked about. The condition in jails and prison are some of the issues there. And of course, municipal fines is also a big issue. I think the education issues kind of speak for themselves, and we're all aware of sort of voting issues now. Access, voter fraud issues, gerrymandering are still some of the issues that plague us. But I do think there's a big role here for lawyers to do some pro bono work. In our community, we are faced with a landlord-tenant court where there's probably roughly 30 to 40% more evictions that go through our landlord-tenant court than Chicago. And we're about 1/3 of the population of Chicago. And so there are lawyers in our community that are rallying to really get a right of representation in landlord-tenant court to deal with the housing crisis that people are facing. And most recently in Detroit, our courts have put a stay on evictions, but that stay is going to be lifted soon as we start to sort of come out of this first wave of the pandemic. I would tell you, clinics like driver's license restoration are so critically important because revoking driver's license for things like unpaid fines, minor crimes that aren't related to health and safety issues, take away people's ability to get to work, maintain work, and same with the healthcare implications. So I would say we have to focus our pro bono efforts in places where they can have the biggest impact on getting at these systemic issues. It's not to diminish doing wills and other things like that, but if you have a choice, I would say, think about where you can have the greatest impact on these issues that do touch this systemic issue of racism.
So, Eve, I can't touch this area without letting you chime in on it. And I'm most Bradley started off his well-spoken comments talking about that he didn't see much difference in some of the issues, and I'm wondering, for some of the historical issues, has your approach changed, and what do you see in terms of the issues of yesterday and the issues of today?
Yeah, unfortunately, some of the issues they've changed, they've morphed slightly, but they are still just as prevalent. And voting rights, I think, is a perfect example. We even have instances where law firms in partnership with civil rights organizations are litigating poll taxes. So things that we thought were of yesterday are rearing their ugly head. And so unfortunately, that is a reality. We are seeing a number of civil rights organizations sort of take up the mantle that I think was started towards the end of the civil rights movement, and that's really focusing on economic justice. And so there's a lot of focus on, how is it that you bring empowerment to Black communities and you work with Black businesses, Black entrepreneurs, education to the extent that that's contributing to economic empowerment. And so there's particular focus with regard to that. In fact, recently there were a number of Black lawyers that came together, I guess, in Philadelphia, and worked directly with the Black Chamber of Commerce to provide pro bono legal assistance to Black businesses. And so that is, it developed as part of the civil rights movement, but I think there's a particular focus now on thinking through what we can do with regard to economic empowerment issues. I just want to say I love that Bradley mentioned the driver restoration issue, because it's a great example of what you can do to be involved immediately to address a systemic issue, but also an example of where you can put some long-term strategic effort to try and change policies. So there are 44 jurisdictions in the United States that suspend driver's license as a result of fines and fees. And so essentially what we are doing is criminalizing poverty. And this is disproportionately impacting Black and brown communities. I believe that in New York, it's 80% of the people who are pulled over and arrested for driving on a suspended license are Black and brown. And so this is an issue that really does impact communities of color. And what we are seeing across the US and different jurisdictions are law firms and in-house legal departments coming together to provide pro bono assistance directly to individuals who are being impacted by these laws. But in addition, working with those in their communities to try and change those policies. And so it's a great example of doing something that's immediate, that can bring some real benefits to those who are impacted by these laws, but also focusing on the long term and being strategic about efforts. Some of the other areas where we're seeing a lot of engagement and sort of recognizing that not only is this a way to bring assistance to individuals, but focus on systems, is expungement work. And so a lot of law firms and in-house legal departments are doing expungement work, certainly efforts with regard to voting rights and voting protection, and also, as Bradley mentioned, work that focuses on reentry issues. And so making sure that those who are exiting prison systems have access to driver's license identification, and that they are able to successfully reintegrate within the community.
Good. Kojo, I'm going to have you answer or start this discussion on this next question. Each of your organizations has taken steps to contribute to the advancement of racial justice. For example, the top executives of Ford sent the following to employees: "There are no easy answers. We are not interested in superficial actions. This is our moment to lead from the front and fully commit to the fair, just, and inclusive culture that our employees deserve." Likewise, Duke Energy recently pledged $1 million in grants for racial justice and equity. Kojo, as leaders in the law, tell us what leaders in law firms, corporate law departments, and other players in the corporate legal ecosystem can do to forge sustainable, meaningful change. Or as we've said at McGuireWoods, positive, long-lasting change.
Thank you, John. First, a word about that grant you mentioned. We followed that up with another $750,000 in North Carolina. And we did something differently that we hadn't done with previous grants. With this particular grant, we invited groups of employees, particularly members of our African American Employee Resource Group, to participate in the selection of the organizations that would benefit from those grants. So having employee participation was a huge difference in this case versus others. So talking about making lasting change, this is one way to have your employees essentially hold you accountable for the wonderful words that were initially spoken by a lot of institutions a few months ago. But in terms of lasting change, I think it's important that every leader recognize that it's not enough not to be a racist. We have to be consciously anti-racist, and that requires intentionality. That requires waking up every day and saying, I'm going to conquer this beast. And you look for it, you see something, you say something, you address it. You don't let it slide. You don't say that's the way it's been done all these years. A lot of institutions are now examining their own policies, which, I dare say we're not intentionally set up to disadvantage any particular group. But you look at how these policies and practices are implemented and executed, you find that in some cases, it's disproportionately affecting a particular group. And unless you find that out, it's kind of hard to develop solutions. So we all have to examine that in our organizations. Are there any things that we doing today, as benign as it may look on its face, that is disproportionately impacting one particular group, right? And then let's make that change. That's one thing we could do. We've talked about collaboration. I do think it's important that we continue to collaborate with the law firms. And here I'm very grateful for McGuireWoods' partnership. As you know, recently, the Charlotte Triage Project won a couple of awards, one from Eve's organization. And that's out of collaboration, and Bank of America and other institutions are also involved with that. Each of us alone, I don't think, can have the impact that we can collectively have. So I fully support collaboration, and I look forward to more collaboration. And in our organization, I'm a firm believer that what gets measured gets done. And so we've put a lot of these into goals that impact folks' compensation. So pro bono is one of those areas. And thanks to Eve and her organization again for jumpstarting our pro bono efforts many years ago, when she sent me a letter asking us to sign on to the Corporate Pro Bono Challenge, which asked that at least 50% of all in-house legal departments participate in some pro bono a year. I am proud to say that in our organization right now, at least 70% of us participate in pro bono every year. And every member of our leadership team participates every year. This didn't just happen. It required intentional action. And I'm also proud to say most of the things we work on are the things that get at the systemic issues that Bradley and Eve have talked about. In the Midwest, for example, we'll go after economic issues, where we partner with the University of Cincinnati Law School. And we serve folks who otherwise cannot afford lawyers who come in and want to start businesses. We help them set up their businesses. Folks have litigation matters or just need counseling, legal counseling, and we provide all that on a pro bono basis. And in the Southeast, we participate in the expunction project that Eve described. It is crucial. As she mentioned, there's some folks who have already paid their debt to society for whatever crime or charges were filed against them, and yet it continues to follow them around, impacts the ability to get work, the ability to earn money to feed their families. And so it's a huge opportunity to effectively set people like that free, right? They may be out of jail, but they're still bound by the vestiges of crimes that they may have committed years before. And so we're proud of the expunction work that our team does. And I'd like to see, I look forward to doing more of that kind of work.
Thank you, Kojo. I'm going to move because I think did you say we have a few questions? Okay, good. I'm going to go to, Eve, I'm going to put this question out to you. The legendary founder of PBI, Esther Larden, who passed away in 2016, dedicated her 45-year career to fighting for civil rights and access to justice. Eve, you've been a key player at PBI, as we've heard from Bradley, we've heard from Kojo, advancing access to injustice, both working with Esther since taking over your leadership role, since taking over your leadership role. Can you tell us about the impact pro bono programs can have in advancing equity and justice?
Absolutely. And I think it's clear from what we have been talking about this afternoon that pro bono can have a tremendous impact with regard to equity and justice, and that lawyers and that pro bono lawyers have played a vital role over the years. They've been involved in many of the seminal civil rights cases, working in partnership with organizations like the ACLU, Lawyers Committee, NAAC, LDF, Legal Defense Fund, and many more organizations. And as we talked about earlier, we're seeing that work continue around voter suppression. There were recent cases in Pennsylvania and in Georgia and North Carolina. And so pro bono lawyers have played a tremendous role in civil rights and in particular in changing policies, as well as representing individuals in the justice system. One thing that I think is really important for us to think about now that we are in this unique moment and that people are focusing attention on this issue is how can we approach these issues creatively? And one of the things that's on my wish list that I hope that law firms and legal departments do with their pro bono programs moving forward is adopt the themes that we've been talking about, being intentional and being strategic and working collaboratively and coming together and working very closely with the civil rights organizations to think through how can we collectively make a difference. So if everyone on this call decided to pool resources and work very closely with the local civil rights organization, what changes can you make with regard to education? And if 5 other law firms and in-house legal departments come together and work very closely with the civil rights organization and say, we are going to focus on issues of housing, what difference can we make with regard to issues of housing? We could have a tremendous impact with regard to the needs of Black and Brown communities. And so adopting the themes that we've been talking about, I think, is a really important next step for us in thinking about how pro bono can be used to address racial equity issues. Oftentimes, what pro bono looks like within law firms and in-house departments is sort of the 1,000 flower blooms principle. So people are allowed to pursue their passion, and as a result, really fantastic work is being done. But now is a time for us to be purposeful, to develop signature projects that are pooling our efforts so that not only are we focused on engagement, but we're focused on bringing about change. And I think this is a really unique time for us to recognize that. And hopefully that is one of the things that will move forward, and so that we can see pro bono lawyers not just play a role in how they have historically impacted civil rights, but really think about being problem solvers and moving forward with regard to the next generation's efforts around civil rights.
Very good, Eve. I know Bradley and Kojo, you'd like to weigh in, but what I want to do is, given the limited amount of time we have, I want to transition to this last question and then open it up for questions for some of our participants. I know there are some questions. So I'm going to ask each of you to answer this last question before we turn to questions. If there was a single piece of advice you could give to leaders in the legal community about talking to employees and other stakeholders about racial injustice in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing, and given the pandemic's impact on communities of color, what would you tell them? What advice would you give? And I'm going to start with you, Bradley.
Thanks. Well, being conscious of the desire to get to Q&A, I'll be brief. What I would say is, I think it's first important to start listening really deeply. And I have found success in doing this in small groups where there's the psychological safety to share and no judgment, no bad questions. So that deep listening is really important. And then is kind of part of that, making sure that the team's being united, because this does have to be about inclusion. and making sure people do feel a sense of belonging. And then from there, what we're doing is then really sort of doing our own internal exam and audit of our own activities in the status of our diversity actions inside the office, but also with our law firms, and we're also looking at pipeline initiatives. So in order to get to that last sort of introspective sort of audit of your activities, I really do think you need to go through the process of listening to the team, pulling them together so they're united, and then you do the audit so you can come up with some action plans that you can actually put in place.
Kojo?
Sure. I dare say that many organizations are like ours, in that you have stated values. And I bet if you examine all these values, you will see that on their face. They do prohibit or preclude racial injustice. It's about equal opportunity. So my single advice would be, let's live out those values. Let's live out those values, and we emphasize that those core values actually make the company or the organization stronger, smarter, healthier, more productive. If people understand that, I think we'll all be better for it.
Very good. Eve?
Yeah, I speak. These are not easy issues. They are been around for a very long time. It's often hard to talk about them. There are a lot of sensitivities around these issues, and sometimes it's a source of anxiety, and people are nervous to get involved and don't know what to do or don't know what to say. And I think the advice is there is so much to be done, and that we all can play a role. And it's important that we just roll up our sleeves and get involved and rely on each other and trust that we're going to be moving forward in the right direction.
Excellent. Okay, we've got about a little more than 10 minutes, and I'm going to start with some questions here. Okay, here's the first question. And the question is for you, Eve. I am a lawyer of color. It says at a major law firm, probably, but anyhow, I'm a lawyer of color. And our firm has many different pro bono opportunities, but I struggle to find out which one can have the most impact with. What is your advice for a lawyer of color like me who wants to affect or impact racial justice, but is unsure as to what program to get involved in?
Yeah, and because you are a lawyer at a major firm, most likely your firm has a full-time pro bono professional. And so I think a great place to start is to sit down with the person who's responsible for pro bono at your firm to share with that person what you are interested in, and really work with them to identify opportunities that are going to have the greatest impact. This is a conversation that we are having with firms and in-house departments across the country, and there's a real desire to think through not only how can we get involved, but how can we make a difference and where can we make the greatest impact. And so there are going to be allies within your firm who are thinking the same thing that you're thinking and are trying to figure out the same things that you're trying to figure out. And so I would sit down with your colleagues and have these honest conversations. And I think that will produce some really great opportunities for you and for the firm.
Good. All right. The next question deals with mentorship. Kojo, you mentioned in your comments that you mentor people and have been a big proponent of mentorship. I have struggled with mentoring people who don't look or think like me. What advice can you give me? And I want to open that up. The question is stemmed from something from you, Kojo, but I want to open it up to all of you.
That's a very important question, because many times when folks are looking for mentors or mentees, they look for folks who think just like them or look just like them. And that's fine, but I would encourage you to go deeper, go a step further. Take on the challenge. And I want to encourage the one asking the question, you take it on, you'll find out that you're not that different. You will actually find out you are not that different. It's interesting. There was an exhibit on race many years ago that those of us at Duke attended, and we had open conversations about it. And the whole point of the exhibit was that we're not that different. The concept of race was constructed, it's not always been with us. It was constructed several years ago. But if you get behind it, we all want the same things. We all want equal opportunity. We all want, the opportunity to, particularly in the professional setting, to have choice assignments, to do well, to be recognized for the work we do, and to thrive in the workplace. You will find mentees who don't look like you, don't talk like you, want the same things you do. And you just start that conversation going down that path, and very quickly you will find that there are things from your own background, your own experience, that will be valuable to this person that you thought had nothing in common with you. So my advice is to just get started.
Excellent. Bradley?
I think that was a mic drop. Nothing more to add to that.
All right. Eve, you have anything you want to add, or you're good?
I'll just say ditto.
Okay. All right. Here's the next question. When you are trying to push for social justice internally, what's your advice to the response of, quote, "This is a slippery slope," end quote? Who wants to? I'm gonna start with you, Eve, since you seem to be really pensive on this one.
Well, I'm not sure what is meant by this is a slippery slope, and so I wish I could ask a follow-up question of the person who's asking the question.
Well, take your best stab at it. I think what they're getting at. Put the question. Go ahead, Bradley.
I'll take a stab, and then Eve, maybe you can help me out. But I think what the issue is getting at is this issue that we're seeing of corporations around the world filling this gap that have typically been filled by governments, and so companies are stepping into this space of trying to address social issues and trying to push social change more and more. And then the question, I think, to me is, so what issues do you pick to get involved in? And how do you draw sort of the boundary lines around where you're going to weigh in and where you won't? And so for our company, Bill Ford weighed into environmental issues way before it was popular to weigh into environmental issues. We weigh in on LGBTQ issues. And now we have a CEO who's talking about Black Lives Matter. And so for us, when these issues come up, we actually have leadership team discussions around these issues in the moment to decide which ones we're going to get involved in. We try to have an overarching framework so that you can filter them quickly and move on, so that you're relevant when you do respond. But I understand the question, and if you can have sort of an overarching framework that kind of links to the firm ethos and values, that's helpful. And then just honest discussion about each one of these and understanding the impact of weighing in, and really being clear about what you want to stand for as a company. But it's always helpful if it links back to the company's values.
Eve, you want to take a shot?
Yeah, and I think that to Bradley's comment, that raises a great point. One of the things that we consistently advise with regard to pro bono programs is to think more broadly about what your company or your firm supports within the community, whether it's through its CSR initiatives, sustainability issues, philanthropic efforts, community service, D&I. And so to Bradley's comment, thinking about what the framework your institution has put in place with regard to its values and how it's engaging in the community does provide you some sense of where it makes sense to participate. We are hearing that there are some companies that are thinking about how they can have a greater impact with regard to their pro bono legal services in particular. And so maybe in the past they have shied away from doing either impact litigation or policy work. And because of concerns with regard to the company's overall business. And so there are conversations now within companies to be a bit more aggressive and involved in those types of areas. And so I do think it's an opportunity where you can potentially push the envelope, but it is important to talk to leadership, to talk to your pro bono professionals, and to get an understanding of where it is that your company has played and where it's interested in moving forward with regard to these things.
All right, let me get to the next question because we only have about 5 minutes. I have about 5 minutes. All right, as a follow-up to the mentorship question, what about reverse mentoring, where more team members who may be more junior in terms of hierarchy mentor those who are more senior? Have any of the speakers engaged in those programs now or earlier in their career?
John, let me get started on that one, and others can jump in. You know, I view all my mentoring relationships as two-way streets. And eventually, as you get comfortable with a person who started as a mentee, you find that they're speaking to you as well, things that you could do better, or they're giving you ideas that you otherwise wouldn't have thought of. So that's the way I view it. I view all mentoring relationships as two-way streets. You know, so I don't know, but if the person who asked the question is looking for somebody to mentor, I will volunteer myself. So.
Kojo, you've been a great mentor for a lot of people for a long time, so that doesn't surprise me. Bradley or Eve, do you want to respond to that? Have any experience, I should say, with that?
Yeah. So I do the same thing that Kojo does, and I actually structure the mentoring sessions in that way, so that there's an opportunity for the mentee to sort of teach me back. And I think it's a great development opportunity for that person too, to come prepared to think about how to educate and inform me about an issue, instead of it just being a one-way street. And then more recently, what we're doing is we are instituting a program on reverse mentoring around this race issue. And so we're assigning, in the US, we're assigning Black employees to each of the functions, leaders, to be their reverse mentor on race issues.
When did you start that, Bradley?
Just recently.
Wow, that's great. That's great. Eve, did you have anything to add? I think we got time for one more question after this.
I'm good, so we can just move on to the next question.
Okay. Here is I think the last question we'll be able to take. It says, as a leader, this is to all the speakers, as a leader, have you ever had to deal with a subordinate who was clearly racist? If so, how did you handle it? And I'd like to broaden the question a little bit. Forgive me, whoever asked that question, but I'm going to say subordinate or superior.
So it might sound quite Pollyannish, but in my 29 years at Ford, I personally have not encountered it. So no.
And neither have I.
Yeah, and I'll jump in. I haven't in the workplace, and I think to Kojo's comment early on in the program, we all have biases. We all have our own prejudices, whether they're related to race or gender or other issues. And so certainly in my personal life, I have dealt with people who have made comments that demonstrated some type of racial prejudice. And depending on my relationship with that person, whether it's someone that I know personally or not, my approach really is to have an honest conversation. And just to identify how those comments or actions are inappropriate, and to be willing to be frank about that and recognize that it's not an indication of whether someone is a horrible person or not, but that we all can benefit from education about differences and around differences. And so hopefully being able to have conversations that are honest and frank with people that I know, and so that we can all grow together.
Fantastic. Well, look, we promised to keep. Oh, go ahead, Kojo.
I was just going to say.
Bradley, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Bradley.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think that's, in my personal life, that's exactly what I've done, because I have encountered this issue in my personal life. And I think it's important to try to create that safe space, even though it doesn't feel safe on the receiving end, but to create that safe space back so that you can try to have a dialogue about it and not just react, but try to dig in and try to understand and help educate.
Excellent. Well, look, I just want to really, really thank all three of our panelists, Bradley, Eve, and Kojo. This has been everything that I hoped it would be when put this together. And you guys have a voice that, as I said at the beginning, really needs to be heard. So I want to thank you for your time and your participation in this. But I think more important than that, I just want to thank each and every one of you all for what you're doing and have done. None of the folks who are on this panel are late to the table. They have been involved in these issues long before it became popular to be involved in these issues. So I want to thank you for what you all have done, and thank you for how you are leading your organizations. And with that, we're going to close out, and thank you for participating in this webcast. Take care.